Good afternoon and welcome to today's very special webinar. My name's Chris Gleadle and I'm the CEO of the Paddy Ashdown Forum, and in partnership with GPS we have great pleasure in bringing this event to you today. We have two eminent speakers who are both highly accomplished in the forms of Iana Dreyer and Emily Rees, so looking very much forward to their input today. And in a change to the published schedule, our moderator today is Robert Woodthorpe-Brown, who is both the chair of the Paddy Ashdown Forum and has a distinguished and certainly long career in international trade. But before we kick off, I'll just bring to your notice a few house rules, if I may. And just a reminder that today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on both the Paddy Ashdown Forum and the GPS websites after the event. Now, I'm sure there will be a lot of questions today, so I would ask you to get them in good and early. And if you could please place all your questions in the Q&A section. Well, without further ado, I would like to hand you over to our moderator today, Robert Woodthorpe-Brown. And so over to you, Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris, and welcome to everybody. First of all, Guillermo Valdez, the ambassador of Uruguay to Brazil, has been trumped or Bolsonaro'd in the sense that he has not been able to come to us because he has been ordered to go and see President Bolsonaro. So he apologizes to you all, and we have to be nice about him anyway because he will doubtless watch the recording of this meeting. Firstly, I would therefore like to say how we're going on today. I am Robert Woodthorpe-Brown. I am the chairman of the Paddy Ashdown Forum. In addition to that, I was, as Iana knows well, because she spoke at one of my events, I was master of the Worship Company of World Traders in 2017. I visited some 155 countries, most of them on business and some of them on tourism. And I speak a few languages too, as do our panelists today. Our panelists are in fact extremely well versed in the subject, and this could not be a more propitious or impropitious, I'm not quite sure, day to discuss about Mercosur agreement, given the decision that we're about to hear about of the European Parliament yesterday. And we will hear a lot more about that, and I'm sure that is going to bring about quite a lot of questions. But our two speakers, one will go first. Iana Dreyer will go first. She's the founder of Borderlex, which is a subscription website dealing with EU trade. It is well worth it, and I hope that she'll get a lot more subscribers out of this, Iana, for this. She was founded and is chief editor of Borderlex. Before launching her publishing activity in London, Iana worked in think tanks, writing on trade and energy policy in Brussels and Paris. She has worked with the European Centre for International Political Economy, the Institute Montaigne, and the EU Institute for Security Studies. Iana has also worked for the Financial Times Group and has trained in journalism. She is a graduate from the London School of Economics and Sciences Po in Paris. Iana currently spends most of her time between Brussels, Paris, and London. Emily Rees, she, right piece of paper, is a senior fellow of ESIPE and managing director of trade strategies, a trade and regulatory advisory consultancy. A Franco-British national, Emily comes from an extensive career in trade policy and economic diplomacy, having led Brazil's trade and investment agency relations with the European Union and served as deputy trade attaché of France to Brazil. An economist by training, her expertise lies at the intersection of trade, sustainability, and agriculture. Her areas of interest include new generation trade issues, including animal welfare, antimicrobial resistance, environmental food standards, and values in trade. All the sort of issues. She could actually have spoken in any one of our 6 webinars, I believe, or 8 webinars they will be, but very much welcome to you both. Iana, would you like to go first with just set the political scene, please?
Thank you very much. Hello, I'm very pleased to be here to speak to all of you virtually. Thank you, Robert, for having me on this panel. I'm very pleased to see you again. I hope one day physically again, because at the moment I'm not traveling much between London, Paris, and Brussels. one has to stay a lot at home. Very briefly, what we'll do, I think today is really an ominous day, a very good day to discuss this, because the Mercosur agreement, the very final version of the text is not yet out. It's still in legal scrubbing in Brussels. And already we have a vote, not a legally binding vote, but it's an important vote from the European Parliament in the form of an amendment to a usually very obscure and harmless report on trade. And that amendment says that the Parliament will not ratify the Mercosur agreement as it stands for the legal. So,
Iana, could you put up your volume a bit? You are a bit quiet, and
okay, I'll speak closer to the. I need to get myself proper microphone. Yes. So I hope you've heard, despite everything you've heard, what I've said. Yeah. Good. So that sets the scene. So and this comes the same day as a new trade commissioner was just approved as well in the European Parliament, who already announced on Friday, anticipating all the turbulent politics, that he will not table the Mercosur agreement for ratification at this stage, that he will want to seek further commitments or reassurances, jargon says pre-ratification commitments on all these climate issues before he even thinks of sending the text for ratification in the European Parliament and then also to the member states. So it's turbulent. But I'll leave the floor to Emily, who will explain to us actually what are the sustainability provisions in the Mercosur agreement. And then I'll go back to discuss more the general politics that are shaping this, so that maybe that can help us then anticipate what could come next. Thank you.
So Emily, please.
Yeah, thank you, Iana, for that presentation of the state of play of the day. And thank you very much to Christopher and Robert for hosting the debate alongside GPS. It's a real pleasure always to discuss EU Mercosur, even in turbulent weather as today. Essentially, one of the points before we get into the content of what is in this Sustainable Development chapter that seems to be creating quite a lot of commotion is perhaps necessary to take a step back and just remind ourselves this is the first significant trade agreement that Mercosur is actually signing, or at least has negotiated in principle. As Iana very correctly pointed out, the legal text is still not available. So effectively, the points that I will be raising in terms of the content are based obviously on that first agreement in principle, and we should await the legal text in order to delve into all the details. As I mentioned, the EU-Mercosur trade deal is the biggest trade deal that Mercosur has negotiated, and as such, it's the first time that Mercosur has agreed to negotiate a trade and sustainable development chapter, which is very much based on the European template of negotiating free trade agreements. It actually is quite ambitious. It's gone beyond most of the other agreements that the EU has negotiated recently, that it be the deal with Canada, CETA, or the Economic Partnership Agreement with Japan. And why is this? Well, obviously, there's a lot of concern about environmental protection in the region, in the Mercosur region. And so it really was part of the negotiations to be quite ambitious in terms of the content. And if you'll allow me, I just wanted to go through perhaps some of the elements. But I think that reminding that what these sustainable development chapters say is that they say that the trade, the social and the environmental elements are all these dimensions are interdependent today in trade and investment policy and are all mutually reinforcing. And that's why we put in these provisions. Trade and sustainable development, we consider that to be basically environment and labor standards, essentially, that are put into these free trade agreements. That allows rules and provisions that go beyond what you would have if you didn't have a free trade agreement. So in that respect, it actually advances a number of this sort of enhanced cooperation, as the EU likes to put it. I think that one of the points that we want to really make, perhaps get into now, is the environmental aspects of it. And I think that here, one of the points that I always find most interesting in this chapter is that it says that parties shall not, through any sustained or recurring course of action or inaction, fail to effectively enforce its environmental or labor laws. And this goes not only for the Mercosur side, this also goes for the European side. Some of these provisions are actually quite ambitious even from a European perspective, but we can get into that, into the next step. So one of the big questions that has been going through the Parliament is this question of the Paris Agreement. There had been some early wins and talks about Brazil pulling out of this agreement when the country decided to cancel the hosting of the COP 25 in Rio de Janeiro. However, Brazil has never left the Paris Agreement. I think that's very important. Actually, if you look at most of the public policies in Brazil are still geared towards reaching their own national determined contributions under the UN FCCC process, or what we call the Paris Agreement, which is basically to reach 37% GHG greenhouse gas emission reductions until 2025. On the other side, the EU's contribution under the Paris Agreement currently, but we know that that's changing under the new climate law and a number of other elements, that sort of policies that are happening at the EU level, is to reach a 40% of reductions of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. One of the issues that we're hearing a lot in the debate is the fact that Brazil isn't implementing its national determined contributions. As we see, these contributions have to be enforced by 2025, and in the case of the EU by 2030. So I do have some questions around that. Also, when we look at how member states are doing in the EU, the European energy matrix could perhaps take some lessons from Mercosur in terms of renewable energies and being able to divert from fossil fuels. So it depends what element we're looking at when we look at the Paris Agreement. But essentially, this chapter says that we are bound to implement the Paris Agreement under the chapter. Now, moving very quickly, we also have parts on biodiversity. And what are we talking about in that case? We're talking about the implementation of multilateral environmental agreements to which both the EU and Mercosur countries are both signatories. This is the Convention on Biodiversity. It's also the CITES Agreement for the trade in wildlife and illegal wildlife and combating illegal wildlife trafficking. And it's also other international treaties such as that on the plant genetic resources, which, when we're talking about the Amazon, is actually quite relevant. Another big part of this trade and sustainable development chapter is about the sustainable management of forests. When we're looking at questions of deforestation, that becomes a very important element. And one of the parts of this agreement, what it does is that it actually has provisions to include the communities, local communities, indigenous communities within the forest. It's important to remind ourselves that the Amazon is more or less the size of the European Union, but it also has a population of 25 million people that need to have access to economic activities and livelihoods. And this agreement actually provides a number of incentives and proposals and action plans as to how to include these communities better into sustainable supply chains based from forestry, but also to combat all the illegal logging and develop new sustainable value chains for timber. Another point, and I'm going to try and keep it short, is the question of the sustainable management of fisheries. Now, this is actually interesting because the EU has quite a lot to do on this side, on the fisheries side. We know that the Mercosur countries haven't been big traders in fishery products or in agriculture products. And so essentially, I would read this part of the agreement as being more a provision that would apply to the European Union, where we know that in the questions relating to the current negotiations in the World Trade Organization on fisheries subsidies, the EU is one of the parties that might need to make some shifts in order to reach an agreement under the agreed target of the Sustainable Development Goals. Moving very quickly, finally, there's also a question of the responsible management of supply chains. As we know, Argentina, Brazil are in candidature of accession to the OECD. This chapter actually provides provisions that sort of help table these OECD guidelines for how companies should be acting responsibly. And that is quite an important step forward. There is cooperation mechanisms included in it, not only in terms of business and human rights and the Global Compact, but there are a number of international instruments on how ethical business and responsible business should act within this trade and investment relationship, which are included in this chapter and are worth mentioning. Finally, I'll leave the enforcement bit perhaps for our discussion. I'm very happy to go into that point. I understand that that's where there's a lot of debate right now, but also to mention that the agreement also enshrines the International Labour Organization's fundamental conventions. This is standard for the EU, and in a way, both parties, that it be the European Union or the Mercosur countries, everyone has, further steps to go in terms of protecting the right of workers. This agreement actually provides mechanisms to ensure better cooperation in that level, and I think that that's something that we should certainly welcome.
We don't hear you.
Thanks, Emily, for that. Trying to unmute myself and unvideo myself at the same time, but it's beyond me. Iana, would you like to take that on, please?
Thank you. Maybe what I would like to add, what explains why it is so difficult, if this agreement is so interesting and rich and ambitious, as Emily described, why is it still having such a difficulty? And so I'll explain more what the politics is right now of trade and environment in the EU. We have the overall context in the EU, which is, general geopolitical shift, an unprecedented recession, which is really, putting pressure. Public opinion is turning a lot against globalization at the moment. And there's a lot of unemployment, so a lot of grumbling. There is a general greening agenda and a sincere, if probably a bit exotic, attempt at engineering a green recovery. So the relatively new commission we have set quite ambitious goals to decarbonize the economy by 55% compared to 1990 by 2030, and to have carbon neutrality by 2050. This and the parliament, was it yesterday or this morning, voted to have that ambition, the ambition for 2030 to 60%. So we're trying to go somewhere. And added to that also a digital agenda that also tries to engineer our own digital revolution and data and geopolitical protection at the same time. So in this context, this is, as I already said, there's generally lower acceptance of globalization. COVID is just an accelerator. We have deeper social problems that have been building up, similarly to other countries in the United States. we can compare a lot with other Western countries, the United States. We have part of the population that has suffered from adjustment. The financial crisis in 2009 has had very long-term effects, stagnation of incomes. The digital revolution has led, parts of the population a bit, to lag behind. Environmental policy is also extremely divisive in the EU. We've seen that with the yellow vest demonstrations in France, which were triggered by an environmental tax on cars that disproportionately affected not, middle-class urban dwellers, but car driving people who feel they're on the declining end of society at the moment. So this is a very volatile political environment that we're having here. So it makes trade policy and trade agreements extremely difficult, and they're easy targets if you want in such an environment. And then we have also, then now to the policy trends in the EU itself. How does that affect trade policy itself in the EU? We have several things coming together, and that explains the situation with Mercosur now. It's not 1999 or 96, whenever you put the starting date of the negotiation. This is 2020. First of all, we have a shift from negotiating agreements to enforcing agreements. We've had a whole 15 years of negotiating bilateral agreements, ever broader, ever deeper. The last big one that was that's coming to force is with Japan. There's one with Canada that was already mentioned. There's one with Vietnam that came into force, but that is ending. We have a few smaller negotiations going on, but that cycle is over. And now the shift is, okay, let's make the best out of it, because studies so far show that there's relatively low utilization, for example, of the benefits of these trade preferences. And there's increasing demand from civil society, the European Parliament, to better enforce the sustainability provisions. There was a precedent with South Korea, signed an FTA in 2010 with the EU, where it promised to ratify the 8 core International Labour Organization conventions, ILO conventions. 2020, these conventions, I think it's 3 or 4 of those conventions are still not ratified. So now the 8 years on, I think it's 10 years on, the Commission has, in the view of labor groups, finally, started dispute settlement proceedings under the agreement. South Korea, EU-South Korea FTA. Now we also have a trend to put the Paris Climate Agreement on par with human rights provisions as an essential element of any international treaty. So, for example, if the Mercosur agreement had been signed just in 2021, or there be a mandate, it would have been a different mandate, and the association agreement, the framework agreement, where human rights are sort of put at the pinnacle, and if you really violate severely violate fundamental UN human rights conventions, the EU reserves the right to suspend, or the parties, and both ways, to suspend the benefits of the entire agreement, the nuclear option. The Paris Agreement is going to get into that category of agreements. That shows how committed the EU is to this issue. On top of that, because of all these environmental policies that are coming, which affect obviously CO2, the price of CO2 and carbon emissions, but also other issues, wildlife, all these issues, forestry, deforestation, and biodiversity, and that affects, for example, pesticide policy, which I know in Latin America, everyone is a bit upset about those extremely severe MRLs, maximum residue levels. This is something, it's not, the European agriculture sector doesn't like it. For them, it's a huge cost, it's a huge adjustment, and a huge demand. And there's a general delegitimization, I would say, of this sector also in parts of this very green movement we have across Europe. So they are on the defensive. They have to change their business model. They have costs put on them, and they are asking for compensation. The steel sector is asking for compensation. He will get some form of compensation through the carbon border adjustment thing that is coming. We can get back to that. And obviously, other sectors are asking for, especially sugar, for example, for sugar competitors abroad to have similar competitive conditions on regulation. So that is happening as well. This is combined with genuine increased power of some civil society groups, NGOs, whatever you can call them, in the public debate, in the media. The ability of some of these groups to mobilize voters, to send worried copy-paste emails or tweets or whatever to their MEPs is impressive. I mean, it's just massive. It only happens for certain trade agreements. I mean, it happened a lot during TTIP, where all sorts of campaigning groups from Germany to Greenpeace to all sorts of, they really contributed to this transatlantic negotiation fail. I mean, was certainly not the only reason why this negotiation failed, but the fact that it put this negotiation in such a limelight, horror stories about frankenfoods and all these things, it was everywhere in the media. Just very difficult for a politician to say, calm down. It just is very difficult. This doesn't happen for every trade agreement. One could have similar concerns for other trade agreements. It's just some trade agreements capture the imaginations of Europeans more than others. It was a case with the United States, and it's a case with Mercosur. You just mentioned Amazon put fires out there, and with Indonesia, it's about orangutans that die. You have all the teenagers mobilized. That's how it is, and it's not very happy. Brazil is unlucky here in a way. It's a tougher job than even Vietnam, where one could also raise questions, but no fundraising, no imagination, whatever, for Vietnam, really. Not enough in any case to really endanger the ratification of this agreement just last year. It's not rational, but that's how it works. That's politics. Politics are not rational. This we have, and we have obviously the European Parliament. It's not the only actor here, but it's a critical actor in this whole ratification process. We shall be reminded that since 2010, the Parliament is a co-legislator, very different from the situation in the 90s. So it has a veto power over it. And the Parliament, since the elections in 2019, is a much more fractured story than the Parliament that was in there before. There is still a majority in this duopoly, EPP, product center-right, and S&D, the Socialists and Democrats. But these two parties are less powerful, much more on the defensive, with more both populist, far right and far left voices, and also a much stronger green group. It makes coalition building, consensus building much more unpredictable, and makes everything much more unstable. And I think this is exactly what we've seen with the vote on this report. And this report was supposed to be talking about the 2018 trade policy and how it was implemented. So it's very boring, but the Parliament made it something about a general discussion. It's a new Parliament, so they want to put their mark. They didn't manage to agree in committee on a specific amendments. So they send these amendments to plenary. This is a sign that consensus is difficult, and the plenary voted how it voted. So it's difficult. This is not legally binding. It doesn't mean everything is over for Mercosur, but it is a signal that you'll have to, everyone involved in the EU, and also diplomats and political actors on the other side, to take this into account and to make sure the Parliament is happy, whether you like that or not. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there, and then let's have a conversation.
I'm not getting any questions, but I'm getting comments coming through in the chat room, starting with Horacio Sanchez Caballero, who is the chairman president of GPS. Firstly, he starts off, Emily, saying you had an excellent and well-balanced speech, so therefore you've got a fan in Buenos Aires. And just to remind that the Mercosur countries account for 4.5% of total greenhouse gases. No-till and precision agriculture used in Mercosur are climate-friendly and a preservation of natural resources. I bet that wasn't discussed in the European Parliament. And then, very important, putting on the table well academic data to avoid discussing ideologies or preconcepts. Next one is Brazil is running cars since 1970 with ethanol, the opposite of diesel cars running all over Europe. In other words, it really takes out the point that the Europeans are expecting Mercosur countries to do things they're not doing themselves. This is probably the reason for the negative reaction of the mail bag or the email bag or the Twitter bag of the parliamentarians, because our farmers do not want the same sort of restrictions we want to put on other people's farmers. And the fisheries one is quite amusing as a Brit.
Perhaps if I may jump in on this point.
Emily, please do.
I think that firstly, we saw in the last European parliamentary elections that this is not only about farmers' interests and protectionist groups that are requiring this greening. There is a societal demand for this across Europe. So I think that that's something that is often a misconception on the Mercosur side, that it is only protectionist movements that are behind this. On the other hand, what we see is that the debate in Europe is also quite misinformed. Some of the recent Green Deal pledges or strategies that we're seeing coming out of the European Union, and I'll take the example of the biodiversity strategy, comes very far from what is already implemented in Mercosur to protect the environment. And is requested of farmers in that region, and they don't get subsidized with the Common Agricultural Policy to do this. It is mandatory, and they, in order to export to Europe, they have to ensure that that they're meeting these environmental standards. So, for instance, the cap here that's being proposed now in Europe is to protect, 10% of land which is being used agriculturally in Europe to protect biodiversity. Well, in a country like Brazil, the minimum is 20. It goes up to 80% in other regions and certain biomes. It depends on which biome and its sensitivity. It goes from 20 to 80%. There's no financial support for this. And this is on top of having to have an implementation of biodiversity corridors to ensure that animals can move around across territory. So, I mean, I use that as just a simple example to show that, often what we find in this debate is unfortunately, because I think we could all benefit from a bit more of an informed debate. It doesn't mean that either side has got it all right, but it doesn't mean that either side's got it all wrong either, is to perhaps have a debate that's based slightly in more informed data. I mean, this is obviously what us trade analysts, we would love to see happen a bit more often and a bit less ideologically prone. I think Iana said, it captures the imagination, right? Indeed, just to be able to have these conversations based on a bit more facts and a bit less ideology, I think would be very useful. And that would avoid this sort of moral grandstanding that we're seeing today coming out of certain of our elected politicians in the European Union. Today, for instance, we're seeing reactions saying that, it's actually the Mercosur side aren't implementing the Paris Agreement. But yet again, as I mentioned earlier, the EU hasn't met its own commitments, although it's obviously looking at a much more strengthened ambition in that domain. I think it's important to remember trade deals to my understanding, and I think that this is also the understanding of the European Commission, are not here to police this UN agreement, which is the Paris Agreement, as much as important as it is. There are other instruments out there, and these trade deals can obviously help provide impetus, but is it up to the European Union to use its trade deals to start policing international agreements? That is a real question that I think must be debated properly.
Maybe if I may,
yes, please, Iana.
If I may react to that after also years of observing this politics. I mean, as politics is not rational. It's completely absurd very often. Facts at the moment have really a hard time to get anywhere. It's just not trade agreements. It's really everything, vaccines, whatever. It's extremely difficult. My experience with successful, even if risky, trade agreements that have passed Parliament and other national parliaments. It depends how they decide to ratify the EU and member states, which type of ratification they will opt for when they get there. If it's EU only for the trade part or whatever. I think they have not settled on this yet. However, I mean, my experience with this is that successful partners have actually been engaging very early. Key countries, parliamentarians in the European Parliament very early have direct access to the office of the chair of the International Trade Committee. Not just have the ambassador talk to the chair of the International Trade Committee, missions, invite him, have him talk to people, engage him, reassure him. This is another type of diplomacy. It's an all-government diplomacy, where the whole government in the country puts a lot of these energies into that deal with the EU and goes over not only to Brussels, but to all key member states. And once the agreement is ratified or signed or pre-ratified, that's only the beginning, I would say. When I see how the Canadians have to still deal with problems with CETA, I find that they're very good, but it's an all-government effort. They're all over, and they are very good at sort of toning down all the prices. They know this agreement is not yet a done deal because it still needs to be definitively ratified in some member states. They're all over it. Vietnam was very clever. I mean, these guys are extremely clever. They really managed to engage the European Parliament very cleverly. Obviously, they have historic ties with a country like France, but there are so many sensitivities on everything from rice to fish that it could have gone wrong. They've been very good at, having very intelligent, smart, smooth diplomatic relations in the capital, which help things later in Brussels. And personally, and that's my experience in observing with Mercosur, I haven't seen that coming from South America, and I think it could have a cost. So I would say invest in that, and it's for a 10-year period.
I'm getting some comments coming in from Horacio again, and saying, firstly, in Mercosur, we have a lot to learn from the EU, but please do stress the importance of discussing on the basis of data and not preconcepts. And he says, and even if it's a pity what's happening in Amazon, the legislation in Brazil is quite good and strict. The point is that the government doesn't fight the illegal activities. And then he says also, remember that Mercosur includes 4 countries, and even if Brazil represents 3/4 of the agribusiness, the voice of Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay must be heard. He points that one out. And he also, Iana, he's commenting to you, a very good definition of the real political world, especially in the countries are rich, they can invest a lot in pushing their ideas. And Pablo is asking, do you think that withdrawing from the agreement is the way to preserve the environment, the green logic of the European Union, where the trade with them takes into account the environment, therefore would it not be contradictory? So in other words, the main point also coming through is I have some political background myself as being head of international relations of my party for 14 years, and now on the Bureau of Liberal International. We are very much pushing climate justice. And I'm just wondering what the Renew Europe people, how they voted in Parliament. I don't know, because I didn't know until this morning that it was voted against. Knowing them, the French voted one way and the others voted another, but you may possibly confirm that, Iana.
No, exactly. I mean, I'm talking to to both sides of this Renew divide, and I know the rapporteur is from Renew. He's from Catalonia, and he published a very interesting op-ed on Borderlex, more in favor, and he said exactly that. We can actually not afford to walk away from Mercosur, precisely also because of these commitments in environment and the potential loss of EU influence. Some people say the rich countries want to have influence, and they tend to have more influence than less rich countries. You walked away. That's not the influence. So yeah, all these are absolutely fair points. My point is only about this engagement with the policy. It's not because the agreement is signed that it's through. I think it's possible to get an agreement through based on facts. Take your time, not now, and do it right, and then do it in the long haul with engaging the right people, because there are many people in the European Parliament, for example, that are really upset. what happened? It could go the other way around, but it will need a lot of diplomatic. And that's my question I would have for the other side. Where were we in Argentina on this, or in Brazil itself? And I think maybe also from the perception in Europe, because there was this point about the legislation in Brazil being very good and the implementation, there is a sense in Europe that the current president of Brazil, I'm not there, I don't follow the politics every day, he's probably not the right person to talk to at the moment, because there is a sense that he's encouraging this, or at least being very lax about the implementation of this legislation. I may be wrong or right, but that's the perception. So it seems to be that there's certain type of politics. If they go away, a lot can be calmed down as well.
Perhaps picking up on Horacio's point, yes, Horacio, Mercosur is for the 4 countries, and they're 4 countries also with very different specificities, different requests also from the EU in terms of this relationship, different, openness to trade. If you take Uruguay, for instance, it's a country that often perhaps feels a bit trapped within that wider bloc, but is better off being part of it in order of seeing these trade deals. There are also very different levels of economic and social development, not only between these countries, but within these countries. Obviously, a lot of the focus in Europe is on Brazil, and that is due to not only the sheer size of the country, which is a continental size country, but obviously, I think once again, to quote Iana, how it captures the mind. As any French schoolgirl, I used to have to read Claude Lévi-Strauss at the university in school, and we all learn about the anthropology of the Amazon. It really is a region that captures the mind so much that it's often not actually explored, or there isn't enough knowledge about it. Also, in comparison to other agreements, I would say that if we take agreements perhaps with perhaps the last one, the last agreement with Japan, I think there's an understanding of the cultural gap, whereas Mercosur and Europeans actually are so close to each other that they actually don't understand each other often, because the feeling of being so close through, obviously the historical ties between these 2 regions means that we think that we have the same cultural understanding. Again, this is the first big agreement for Mercosur, so there isn't the same sort of maturity in terms of what Iana's been bringing up in terms of how you defend this. How do you lobby the other side in terms of making sure that through the capitals you get your ratification? That there is, it really is the first time that we're going through this process from a Mercosur side. And therefore there's it's sort of an unfortunate learning curve, which is being very steep right now. Coming back to Pablo's point on what happens if Europe steps out of this agreement, I mean, I'm very concerned about what that would mean from a sustainable development position. I don't think that it would revert the way, for instance, agricultural production happens in those countries, because the understanding of the fact that you're selling to the world anyway means that you are already producing under a number of standards, and those are quite actually, as everyone has already mentioned, produced under very stringent legislation and environmental standards. The issue is a much more geopolitical one. It basically pushes Latin America in a way, it would push this region into a higher risk of being pulled within the US-China, I think, tensions, right? So we know that the European Union has been gradually over the last decade losing a lot of space in that region. It's no longer Mercosur's first trading partner. The first trading partner is China. And there was an interesting statistic that I just saw before jumping onto this, this call, which is that this year, just the soy exports of Brazil to China now surpass the whole of the trade of Brazil with the US. So if we're just looking at how the trading relationships are changing very rapidly, how the world is moving also from this neoliberal order, rules-based system towards a much more geo-economic relationship in the way that we trade and the way that we deal with one another. You want to have more friends on your side, if I can put it that way. And in this case, this agreement actually provides much more it gives more leverage to the European Union in terms of seeing out the implementation of certain aspects of environmental policy within that region than if it walks away. I think that would certainly not have a good outcome in that region.
We've got Cristina Cortez is asking us how we know the problems we're getting with ratification in the European Union. How is it getting on for Mercosur countries?
Perhaps I can quickly jump in.
Emily? Yeah.
Well, more about it.
Iana can do it.
No.
Once again, I think as we just mentioned, trade deals are still, I mean, Mercosur didn't embark on this negotiation of all these preferential trade deals when the rest of the world, let's say the big European Union and the US, were negotiating all these networks of free trade agreements. And now that the EU is pulling back a bit, it's the moment that Mercosur is sort of jumping on the bandwagon and trying to get all these negotiations sort of unrolling. As such, you don't have a history of the same kind of parliamentary pressure or this co-decision that we have in Europe. It's less defined, I would say. In many ways, the ratification will depend a lot on what happens here in Europe, more than on specific outcomes. I think one of the points of concern was with regards to the change of government in Argentina, and whether Argentina would back away from a more liberal stance in terms of trade. The understanding is that it's still in curvy moments in that front, but this commitment towards the European Union has been kept by Argentina, and I think that the ratification would occur in all four regions. Now, I think that there is one important thing to keep in mind when we're looking at ratification on the Mercosur side, is that the agreement actually foresees the fact that if for any reason, one of the countries is unable to ratify quickly, the countries, as long as the EU is ratified, they can implement it without all four being within it. It complicates things, obviously, but there is obviously that option has been put into the way of handling the ratification on the other side. From the European perspective, we often think of Mercosur as a bloc that functions like the European Union, and it really isn't that way. These are very much four independent countries which are in a customs union that is not as integrated as the European Union. So we have to be slightly more mindful when we look at the ratification in that sense. And then, you know, the question is, you know, how the private sector and how the civil society in those countries will react to the current debate that's happening here in Europe, because it does feel like they're being snubbed slightly. Hopefully that wouldn't affect the ratification, but I mean, it begs to wonder whether the European Union wants this agreement, which gives it a first mover advantage in a region that has been, you know, historically closed and historically protected behind high tariff barriers. So that also will feed into the debate on the other side, I believe.
I've got a note from Eduardo Dreyer of ABAG in Brazil, and his notes to all of us that in terms of the food market, China and India represent 35% of all consumption worldwide. Adding that other countries in Asia Pacific, it comes to close to 45%. And Horacio is saying, Emily, that's why I insist that more information should be offered from Mercosur in order that the EU could go beyond the stuff you learned in school. He says the college times data, but I think he means the stuff we learned in school. And he says that GPS are considering to prepare a document with a PAF to fulfill this gap. That will amuse Chris, I think. Information is clearly the key in all of this, and I don't know who is going to have to educate the parliamentarians, but I think one thing we may have to do is jointly, GPS and ourselves, try and send a document, and maybe that's something Emily and Iana, you might like to have input into, because it seems to be, I mean, if you want this thing going forward, maybe we'll have to, you know, do a bit of
on that point, if I may, Robert, I think we're not at a stage of documents anymore.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think that it's a much bigger push that is required at this stage. There needs to be faces other than ours, a bit more diverse public, let's say, to actually hash out some of these questions. But I think that we've passed that point. That the point of position papers is, in my view, you know, past at this stage. I think that as we pursue into the next moments of the ratification, obviously depending on seeing scrutiny of the legal text, because I think that at this stage it would be unwise to be taking strong point of view if you haven't actually read the legal text, which is why I always find it quite astounding when member states position themselves without having had that text in hand. But essentially at this stage, we need much more bridges, we need much more meetings, as Iana mentioned, we need more conversations in the member states. Again, I think that on the European side of things, we have learned from past ratifications and what is required. I think Canada offered us a good window into how difficult these conversations can get and how important it is to also engage in countries, in the member states, in order to bring the discussion up to a fore in Brussels. And in that regard, we are running out of time.
I would absolutely concur with what Emily said. This is very late, and the type of engagement is not just lobby. Facts. I mean, it is, well, yes, facts, but this is, you know, whole of government commitment to this and spreading all over Europe, or at least in the strategic places of power that are pivotal. And it's not just the Commission, frankly, and it's not just a few diplomats from the embassy who will do the trick. This is something much bigger. What I would also suggest, I mean, the EU, we've talked about the sustainability dimension, which is a big topic, but obviously Mercosur is much broader than that. And the EU is having a broader conversation with itself about strategic autonomy. It wants to be much more of a united, independent security actor. This has ramifications for its trade policy, for example, on where it sources its raw materials, how can it diversify its supply chains, all these kind of topics, where in a time where China, we don't know where it's going, not really opening up some of these export markets, where nobody knows where the United States, which is also the biggest export destination for European products, where this is going with the United States. You need other outlets for its beautiful products and its industry. And I think trying to reconnect with some, with people who will respond in Parliament and everywhere, who will respond to that kind of argument, what Mercosur can play in that broader geostrategic dimension of EU trade policy at the moment. I think South America, this bloc has a lot to offer on precisely these kind of topics, including rules-based trade, including being a friend of the EU in the WTO on dispute settlement, when Brazil, signed up to the MPIA, this alternative stopgap appellate body. I mean, show your friend beyond just this thing. Sort of sometimes, talk about something else than just those fires, which need to be tackled. I think this is extremely important. The Europeans will want to see something happen there, whatever it is. But lift the discussion and broaden it. Don't let certain types of people also determine the agenda and determine the conversation. That's a difficult, that's a conversation within Europe we need to have, but also a conversation where maybe Mercosur actors could have also a role.
And on Iana's point of the open strategic autonomy, part of that strategy is based on diversification of markets. Yeah. So in that regard, Mercosur does offer this diversification of markets. Yeah. And I would add another point, which I think is one that we don't hear enough in this debate, which is that when we're looking at COVID recovery, this particular deal favors a lot of the Mediterranean countries, which has not always been the case with earlier trade deals. These are the countries which have the historic ties with that region, and are obviously those that would, have more chance of trading opportunities, of looking for incentives to glue these bi-regional value chains in a way. So we're thinking about inputs of leathers into the Italian shoe industry as an example. But I mean, these are just, they're examples of the kind of trade that would happen on the basis of this agreement, and that de facto does benefit a number of countries which haven't been the great beneficiaries of the earlier trade deals, such as the ones in Asia and elsewhere, or with Canada. Not meaning that they haven't benefited from those agreements, but this one particularly in terms of also the countries that have been most hit by COVID, that are more dependent, for instance, on tourism. Those are the ones which would also have, that extra little macroeconomic boost. I think we have to be careful not to put too much economic growth onto these trade deals, but they do help. And in that regard, especially if we're talking about SME to SME business, these are countries with strong SME networks that would indeed have a lot to benefit from these agreements. And I really would like to see that part of the debate now being put forward slightly more.
Ricardo Carciofi has said that the Green Deal implies that the EU will put in place higher standards on food imports, deforestation, carbon footprint, etc. In that case, is it better for Mercosur countries to have the agreement up and running? In case of substantial delays, what would be the main impacts for Mercosur exports to the EU? I quote. Anybody going to answer that one?
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to take that one. I mean, essentially, imports obey the legislation of the importing country. So those exports will still have to abide by maximum residue levels and other legislations that are put into place to protect, you know, the food safety of Europeans. I think that we need to make this very clear. A trade deal doesn't change those things. With regard to the European Green Deal, one of the things that, and I'm going to come back to one of my earlier points, which is the fact that this region, Mercosur, I think Horacio pointed out, is responsible for 4.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, actually has a very clean energy matrix. So if we're going to enter into questions relating to the carbon life cycle analysis or assessment of products coming in from that region, I believe that region would probably score pretty well.
Also, in the export discussion, I mean, I'm not an expert on tariff rate quotas, but what I know from other trade agreements is that it's very difficult for some exporters after a trade agreement comes into place to actually really benefit from those quotas. So because sometimes they're not large enough to warrant the kind of investment that is required to comply with all those EU standards, because you still need to comply with them, et cetera, et cetera. The administration is very difficult. Frankly, I mean, I don't think that there will be a big boost, specifically those iconic products such as beef and sugar to the EU, quota, no quota. Partly this is also because sugar, it's a different conversation. Beef, for example, there is generally literally less appetite for meat and beef in Europe at the moment. We have why they're shouting so much about this in the country in France where I'm now, it's partly because we have a beef and meat sector in crisis because people start eating less meat. They're in trouble anyway. So I don't know how this equation will be, but if you have the sort of traditional, very mercantilistic view of exporting more of those products to the EU, that probably will not materialize, or at least not as strongly. What it will help is in many other sectors, people who participate in supply chains, other less obvious products in food or clothing or elsewhere that are not up. Or even other agricultural products and citrus products. Not that bad in that sense. So look at there will probably be a boost there, and what I understand from the economics of this, a lot will be also about investment in Mercosur, which is probably not a bad thing. And what I understand from Brazil was this desire from Brazilian industry to finally open up to be part of this supply chain world. Maybe it's a bit late, but at the same time, it's also an opportunity because within the EU itself, we're having a very new conversation about our supply chains, their sustainability, their resilience to risk, etc. So this agreement, given the quite significant reduction in tariffs, that's what they do. They foster investment and sort of a both-way trade in components, services, tasks. This is a huge opportunity, I think, for both sides actually, to do something about it and integrate the fabric of some industries. And that's less visible, it's maybe less discussed, but personally I find this is very important, and that's something to communicate to both sides.
To what extent do you think that the countries concerned wanted a deal because they wanted to rely less on China, because China has tried to purchase land, do all sorts of things in the area, and there has been certainly being resistance. People like to sell to China, but they don't want to sell land to China, goods only. Do you think that's why the Mercosur countries would like the deal, because they want to rely less on the Chinese market?
I don't particularly think that that's ever been sort of the logic behind this agreement, not from the beginning of the kickoff of the negotiations where it already had a point of departure which was slightly different, but certainly not in its conclusion either. It really is about opening up gradually Mercosur into international supply chains. Working with Europe seems to be a really easier partner, or at least that was what has always been thought, as a bi-regional supply chain movement. I think, as Iana correctly mentioned, there are a lot of supply chains which we don't really think about. It can be boat parts, or buttons, or sugarcane-based soles for shoes. All the bioplastics that Europe needs to implement its Green Deal. All these products that we don't necessarily think about, but actually become a final product, which actually works very well into the European Green Deal, and where there is a lot more complementarity. What the EU agreement does for Mercosur is that it allows to test run, let's say, a first really big agreement, and then use it as the basis to negotiate other agreements with whom the EU already has finalized agreements. And in doing so, that allows for, and I won't bore everyone, but accumulated rules of origin and other preferences that are really interesting when we're looking now at Canada or Korea, which are also in the Mercosur negotiating pipeline. So the actual negotiating pipeline has been mirrored, let's say, on this EU network, and that was done for a reason, is that these companies already trade a lot. And I know that might not seem so simple, because often they are SMEs, but there is a lot of trade that goes through between Mercosur and the European Union, and this agreement would provide more incentive to harmonize standards, to look towards an approximation of rules rather than a divergence of rules. And that's, we know how the Brussels effect works, right? How Brussels influences rules making and standards around the world. That's also a big part of this agreement. We have a big part of the world which is still caught between different standards, European, American, South American, their own, perhaps slightly now a bit more China, although that remains to be seen. And this agreement allows the EU perhaps to have more influence over the kinds of rules that would be put into place, not because it's mandatory through the agreement, just simply the proximity that happens between companies means that they have no interest in having different production chains, one for Europe, one for domestic, one for another market, right? And also, we spoke very briefly about industry, and I know that wasn't the topic of today, and perhaps that would be the topic for another webinar, but the industry of Mercosur needs a stimulus in terms of its own competitiveness. And the EU is a great supplier of services, of technology, of solutions across the board that comes with this agreement. And also we can put in the investment part, because the public procurement is quite substantial in this agreement. All of this is transformative in terms of also bringing up the competitiveness level of Mercosur to go out and compete into the rest of the world. And that's often a part of the agreement that also unfortunately gets overlooked.
I would not, I think the industry part should not completely be separated from the sustainability dimension. When both sides are, through their policy, incentivized to be greener, to have companies, leading companies that have new technologies, etc., capable, able to work together and have more efficient and cleaner supply chains, I think that's also a bonus. We need to look at that in detail, but I found your examples really very interesting in that sense. But I think it's also for other more high-tech products, definitely the case. Energy-saving devices and things.
Horacio is commenting also that that Europe has got a lot to learn from the environmental standards, the agricultural methods of the Mercosur countries, notably Argentina and Uruguay, and that perhaps they could benefit from this. That this is not just a one-way street.
Certainly.
Well, I mean, this is one of the things that, agriculture in Europe, one of the reasons why, we hear a lot of defensive arguments is it's a very different type of, let's say, vision of agriculture. Europe believes that its agriculture, in a way, is a public service. Nowhere in Latin America do we believe that agriculture is a public service. It is a good that is traded, and it provides economic development, social development, across the region. In this regard, Europe has always been a lot less innovative. There's a lot more subsidies, and in much of the same ways that subsidization of industry has kept Mercosur from reaching its full competitiveness, you could say the same of Europe with its own agriculture. The fact its hyper subsidization has also kept it from looking to be innovative in many ways. So we see, for instance, in the digital world, in Mercosur, how digital and agriculture have really now work hand in hand to have better environmental practices, be it in terms of water use, artificial intelligence applied, to the fields. This is something that we don't see to the same degree in Europe. And indeed, a lot of the technologies which are coming out of Latin America could indeed be quite useful in terms of transfer of knowledge and sharing of best environmental practices in Europe.
Right. I think that we're coming close to our witching hour. Would you like, Iana, do you want to say last few words, and Emily as well, and then we will give the thanks.
Very difficult. Fundamentally, I think with Mercosur, we have reached a critical point, and it could go both ways. So I think there is a lot of political work to do for those who want this agreement to go through. That's what I would say. Obviously, be more factual on just the sustainability dimension, but also broaden the conversation about Mercosur. I think would also be useful and attract other kind of support from elsewhere. Thank you.
Thanks, Iana. Emily.
As a final note, I wish we could have more debates such as this within the European Parliament. I think that would be useful.
I'm finding a last comment, even though the EU Mercosur FTA hasn't been ratified yet, do you think there's a possibility of Mercosur countries to become more economically integrated with the EU, just as a customs union that Turkey has with the EU? I think Turkey and the EU at present is a bit problematic, but I think we've really answered all the questions that we've had so far. Thank you both very much. I'm getting, you both know the Spanish word piropo. I'm getting a few piropos to the pair of you. From our audience in Latin America. I'll translate piropo to the Brits later on. Thank you both very, very much for this. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for ELF and GPS and for Aurelial to be our sponsors in this. I think it's been sensational, and the audience's comments say that as well. So thank you very much, and thank you all to the audience for joining us today. Thank you very much.